Imagine someone sitting very still in a quiet room. They have decided that today is the day they will finally be free of their ego. They close their eyes, straighten their back, take a deep breath, and say inwardly, "I am going to get rid of this terrible, selfish, noisy little me once and for all." And at that very moment, the me becomes more solid than ever. The watcher tightens. The breath tightens. The mind becomes a courtroom, and you are both the accused and the judge. The more fiercely you try to push the ego away, the more it clings to you, like a shadow that only grows darker under a bright searchlight. This is the paradox. The ego that tries to vanish only grows stronger. You see, the whole trick begins in a misunderstanding about who this I really is. Most of us grow up with the sense that there is, somewhere behind the eyes and between the ears, a little controller, a thinker inside the head, a feeler inside the chest, a sort of spiritual monkey pulling levers, making choices, worrying about outcomes, and receiving all the praise and blame. We take this for granted. We say, "I am anxious," as though there were a separate I who has somehow been saddled with this unfortunate creature called anxiety. We say, "I must get rid of my ego," as if you could separate the warrior from the sword he's holding. But look more closely. Who is the one who wants to get rid of the ego? Who is the judge that condemns the illusion? When you examine it very carefully, you find something rather strange. The one who wants to kill the ego is the ego. It's like fire trying to burn itself, or a knife trying to cut itself, or your teeth attempting to bite themselves. The very energy that says, "I must become pure, I must become spiritual, I must become enlightened," is the same old ego in a new, very spiritual outfit. We are very clever at this game. Previously, the ego played at being the successful one, the admired one, the wealthy one. Then, perhaps, that lost its shine, and it became the humble one, the helpful one, the savior, the healer. And finally, when even that costume wears thin, it becomes the enlightened seeker. The ego loves nothing more than to be the one who is almost there, always chasing the final realization, always on the edge of perfection, never quite arriving. Because if it actually arrived, it would disappear. So it keeps the goal just out of reach. I'll be fine when I finally get rid of my ego. I'll be free when I've purified every thought. I'll be worthy when I've completely dissolved myself. And so the ego survives not by being big and boastful, but by being small, guilty, forever not good enough. It hides behind spiritual effort. Now, there's a very simple way to see this in your own experience. The next time you catch yourself being proud, jealous, tense, or fearful, notice what happens in the very next moment. Almost instantly, another voice appears. "Oh no, I shouldn't feel that. I thought I was beyond this. This is not spiritual. I have to fix this." Now we have two layers. The original emotion, pride, fear, anger, jealousy. The spiritual critic sitting on top, wagging its finger. The second one feels righteous. It feels holy. It feels like good progress. But in truth, it is simply the ego fighting the ego, like a dog chasing its own tail and being very impressed with how fast it's spinning. You become divided against yourself. Part of you is the sinner, and part of you is the saint, and they fight like two halves of the same person who have forgotten they belong to one another. And the more intense the fight becomes, the more real the whole thing seems. The ego swells with every punch it throws at itself. So the question is not, how do I get rid of the ego? The question is, who is it that believes it must get rid of the ego? Because the very sense of being a fixed, separate controller is itself the illusion. We have this notion that there is a solid self, a little lump of me-ness somewhere inside that owns the body and operates the mind. We think of it like a driver in a car. But if you look at your actual experience, can you find such a driver? You can find thoughts. You can find sensations. You can find feelings. You can find intentions arising, doubts arising, desires and fears dancing like weather across the sky of awareness. But where, precisely, is the little owner of the weather? Where is the solid core that never changes, that stands outside the flow and says, "These are my thoughts, my feelings, my sensations"? If you try to point to it, something slippery happens. You say, "I'm here, in my head." But what you really find are images and words, sensations of pressure, echoes of inner speech, visual impressions behind the eyes. Try to isolate the thinker of thoughts. You notice that thoughts simply appear. They arrive unannounced as if from nowhere. You don't, in fact, think them in the way a carpenter hammers a nail. You notice them. Try to isolate the feeler of feelings. A wave of sadness arrives. Warm, heavy, dense in the chest. Did you construct it piece by piece? Or did it simply swell up like a tide? And then, after a while, it subsides. Who turned off the tap? The I we speak about so confidently is not some solid thing. It is a pattern, a story, a habit of thinking of ourselves as a separate subject standing apart from the world. And in that pattern, a curious loop emerges. I am the one who should be different from what I am. That loop is the ego. Now, you might say, "All right, I see that. So how do I break the loop?" You see, the ego has just changed costumes again. It says, I've understood the philosophy. Excellent. Now I shall apply this knowledge to eradicate myself more efficiently. I will practice letting go. I will get really good at surrender." And of course, this leads us right back into the paradox. The more you try to let go, the tighter you become. The more you practice surrender as a technique, the more you are subtly trying to control the outcome. You sit and say, "I am letting go. I am letting go. I am letting go." But underneath, there is a quiet expectation. And when I let go completely, I will be peaceful. I will be enlightened. I will be safe. We are trying to bargain with life. We are saying, "I'll release my grip, but only if you promise to catch me." That is not surrender. That is a business deal. So what does real letting go look like? It's much more ordinary than we imagine. And in a certain sense, it is not something you do at all. Let's look again at something very simple. Breathing. Right now, are you breathing? Or is breathing happening? You can, of course, interfere with it for a little while. You can hold your breath, speed it up, slow it down. But if you stop meddling for a moment, you find that breathing breathes itself. Inhale, exhale. No one in particular is doing it. The heart beats itself. The stomach digests itself. Your hair grows, your nails grow, galaxies swirl, seasons turn, tides come and go, without a little controller inside making it all happen. The sense of a central, separate ego is like a little echo on top of this vast process. It's a commentary that says, "I did that," after the fact. Like a child sitting in the front of a train, turning a toy steering wheel and sincerely believing they are driving the locomotive. It's charming. It's also a kind of play. Now, the moment you see that the ego is a play, something important softens. You no longer need to destroy it. any more than you need to kill the main character at the end of a play to prove that the story was an illusion. The problem is not that the character appears. The problem only arises when you forget that it is a character and start to think that the cardboard crown is made of solid gold. The ego is a useful function. It remembers your name, it pays your bills, it keeps you from walking into traffic. It is a mask worn by the deeper something that lives you. In fact, that's what persona originally means, the mask through which the sound comes. The trouble begins when the mask thinks it is the face. So instead of trying to smash the mask, notice it. Notice how, in a social situation, there is a version of you that appears, the polite one, the witty one, or the shy one. Notice how, with family, another version appears, the obedient child, the responsible parent, the rebellious sibling. These are all costumes, useful, expressive, playful. But in quiet moments, when you stop insisting that you are any particular someone, you may glimpse something else. A silent, aware presence that doesn't need a name. It doesn't argue with your thoughts. It doesn't condemn your feelings. It simply knows them like space, knowing whatever passes through it. This presence is not trying to vanish. It's not trying to be enlightened. It is already what it is. The ego, in comparison, is a kind of ripple, a wave on the surface of that deeper water. Now imagine this. You are standing by a lake at dawn. The water is very still. You can see the reflection of the sky with extraordinary clarity. And then a breeze comes, and ripples appear across the surface. Is the lake now broken? Has it failed? No. The ripples are simply what the lake is doing at that moment. In the same way, the thoughts about me, the worries, the comparisons, the hopes and fears, these are ripples on the surface of consciousness. Trying to flatten them all out with effort is like trying to iron the lake. The more you press, the more turbulence you create. This is why the ego that tries to vanish only grows stronger, because the very struggle against ego is more ego. The very movement of self-rejection, I am wrong, I must be different, is the ego's favorite food. It feeds on resistance. When you say, I shouldn't be angry, you've created two selves, the angry one and the judge. When you say, I must be more loving, you've created the unloving self and the superior inspector. Each time you split in this way, you add complexity to the illusion. But suppose, just for a moment, you experiment with a different approach. Instead of fighting the ego, you include it. A wave of jealousy arises. Instead of, I shouldn't feel this, you simply notice, jealousy is here. A pulse of pride shows up. Instead of, this is very unspiritual, you notice, pride is happening. You don't congratulate yourself. You don't blame yourself. You simply acknowledge. This is not a trick to make the ego vanish. It's an invitation to see through it. Because in the moment of simple noticing, something subtle happens. You realize that what you are is not the content, but the space in which the content appears. You are the noticing, not the thing noticed. The ego is then seen, not as a villain, but as a pattern in the play. And patterns, when seen clearly, don't need to be destroyed. They simply lose their hypnotic power. This has very profound implications for how we live, how we love, and how we die. Consider relationships. So much of our trouble with one another is not caused by what is actually happening, but by the image of me that I'm trying to protect and the image of you that I'm trying to manage. If your partner criticizes you, notice what happens instantly. There's a tightening, a rising of defenses. How dare they? Or, they must be right, I'm terrible. In either case, the reaction is centered around protecting this fragile image of me. But if you begin to see that the me is a story, a mask, then criticism doesn't need to be experienced as an attack on your existence. It may still sting, of course. Nobody is asking you to be made of wood, but you can observe the sting without spinning a whole narrative of injury around it. The ego says, "You've insulted me." Awareness hears sound waves, sensations, emotions moving through. And in that gap, compassion can arise. You may even see that the other person is also speaking from their own mask, their own frightened, defended image of who they are. Two illusions bumping into one another. When that is understood, forgiveness doesn't feel like a lofty achievement. It feels like the most natural thing in the world. Now, what about fear? Much of our fear is the fear of losing control, of not being able to manage life, of not being able to secure outcomes, of not being able to keep the story of me intact. We worry about the future, not only because of what might happen, but because of what it might say about us. Failure is frightening because it seems to prove, I am not who I thought I was. Success is frightening because we must then maintain the image we've created. So the ego runs along the tightrope, constantly balancing, constantly adjusting. But if we see that there is no solid, permanent me to protect, then what exactly are we so afraid of? The body can be hurt, of course. Pain is real. Loss is real. But the idea of a fixed identity being shattered is an illusion. There is no crystal statue to break. There is only water taking new shapes. This doesn't mean we become passive or careless. It means that our actions no longer come from a frantic attempt to secure a phantom. You can still lock your door, pay your bills, plan for tomorrow. But you no longer do so as if the entire universe rested on your shoulders. You recognize that you are part of a much larger movement, like a single note in a vast symphony. Important precisely because it is not separate from the whole. And then, of course, there is death. Nothing reveals the ego's clinging quite like the prospect of dying. The thought arises, I will not be here anymore. And the I imagines darkness, silence, some sort of terrible blankness, as if you, this limited bundle of memories and opinions, were being tossed into a cosmic dustbin. But ask yourself, who is thinking this? The fear is built on the assumption that the little story of me is the whole of what you are. That consciousness is a product of this tiny organism, and when the organism ceases, everything ceases. However, the sense of being a separate self is already an illusion in life. It is a kind of useful hallucination. So what is there really to lose when the hallucination dissolves? It is not that you, as this ego, will travel intact into some extended future. Rather, the deeper reality that has been playing at being you all along simply stops playing that particular role. The wave sinks back into the ocean. The pattern vanishes, but the water remains. From the ego's point of view, this is terrifying. It wants continuity at any cost. But from the perspective of the water, nothing has been lost at all. In fact, nothing has ever really been separate. So, when you notice yourself longing to kill the ego, to disappear into some pure state of permanent bliss, be gentle. Instead of making war on yourself in the name of peace, consider a different experiment. What happens if, for a few breaths, you stop trying to become anything? Not a better person, not a more spiritual seeker, not even a more relaxed meditator. Just for a moment, you let everything be as it is. Thoughts may chatter, sensations may move, emotions may swell and ebb. You don't have to like or dislike any of it. You simply allow it. the way you might sit by the roadside and watch traffic going by. Cars of anger, cars of joy, cars of boredom. They appear, they pass, and you remain not as the controller of the traffic, but as the simple awareness in which all of this movement is seen. In that allowing, something very subtle and very ordinary begins to shine through. You discover that you were never, in truth, the traffic. You were never the ego fighting to disappear. You were, and are, the quiet space in which it all comes and goes. This realization does not make the ego vanish in a puff of smoke. You will still find yourself getting caught, getting offended, getting proud. You will still play roles. You will still forget and remember again and again. But the difference is this: you will no longer take the forgetting quite so seriously. You will notice, here is the old pattern again, and smile, the way you might smile at a friend who tells the same joke every time you meet. The ego can go on trying to vanish, if it wants to. It can keep dressing up as the hero, the victim, the saint, the sinner. But somewhere in you, there is a deeper knowing that all of this is movement in the one reality that you truly are. So, if you must have a practice, let it be this: not the practice of self-improvement, not the practice of spiritual conquest, but the practice of intimate noticing. Notice how the self-image appears. Notice how it defends itself. Notice how it tries to get rid of itself. And then notice the noticing. Every time you rest as that simple awareness, just for a heartbeat, just for a breath, the ego's desperate project of vanishing becomes less compelling. You do not defeat the ego. You outgrow the need to believe in it. The wave doesn't stop being a wave. It simply remembers it is water. As we come to a close, I invite you not to adopt a new belief, but to experiment in your own direct experience. Right now, as you listen to these words, feel your body, the weight of it, the breath moving by itself, the sounds around you. Thoughts may say, "This is my body, my breath, my experience." That's all right. Let them say it, and then, gently, ask, who is this my? Can you find it as anything other than another thought, another sensation, another ripple? Or is there, shining quietly in the background, a simple beingness that does not need a name? Stay with that question, not as a puzzle to solve, but as a doorway to noticing. Again and again, you will see the ego that tries to vanish only grows stronger. But the awareness that sees this has never been bound by the ego at all. It is not born. It does not die. It doesn't need to be improved. It only ever needed to be recognized.